These three questions can be applied to almost every situation that you're going to see with your parachute during opening or after deployment. Here is another example. After deployment, you notice that your canopy is turning all by itself. You look up, you see that the canopy is there, you see that the canopy is square, but it's turning all by itself. Well, we've still passed yes on the first two questions, so we're going to go on to the controllability and steerability of the canopy. Flaring twice will usually fix a canopy that's turning by itself. Then we're going to do a left, right, and another flare. If the controllability check does not fix the problem, or the canopy cannot be controlled for landing, then you're going to need to cut away with the emergency procedures. Now we're going to talk about what you need to do if you get in a situation where both canopies get deployed at the same time. In this case, both your main and reserve are deployed into the air. There's three different situations that we'll talk about. The first is called a biplane, where the canopies are basically stacked right on top of each other. In this case, you're going to leave the brakes stowed, and you're going to steer the front canopy with the rear risers if you can. If you can't control the front canopy with the rear risers, you can try to control the canopy with the front toggles also. In this situation, you're going to want to fly as straight as possible and don't flare for landing. You want to be ready to PLF once you land, but a cutaway is not recommended. This is considered a stable biplane configuration, and ideally these two canopies stacked on top of each other will stay in a stable situation. This is the second configuration for having two canopies out, called side by side. The canopies are effectively in a stable configuration, bumping together and staying close together. You have two options in this situation. First, if the canopies are not entangled, you can cut away the main parachute and land and fly the reserve parachute. You have to make sure the canopies are not entangled. If you cut away and the main parachute is entangled, it can create more of a situation because your reserve can become entangled also. The second option is to keep both canopies, do not cut away, and fly the canopies together to landing. In this situation, you're going to use the rear risers to try and keep the canopies bumping together. You're going to want the canopies to stay together, that way they don't split apart and turn into the third scenario of a downplane. This is the third scenario, called a downplane. In a downplane, both the main and reserve parachute are basically pointed directly at the ground. In this situation, you're going to want to cut away the main parachute and then land under the reserve parachute. It is possible to collide with another jumper in the air. One way to prevent this is to look before you turn. Always look in the direction of the turn before you start the turn. The lower jumper does have the right-of-way, so the jumper that is the lowest has less visibility above them, so they have the right-of-way. If you end up facing another jumper straight head-on, both jumpers are going to turn to the right to try and avoid each other. If you do collide, the first thing you need to do is to start communicating with the other jumper. If it's too low for a safe cutaway, then both jumpers need to deploy their reserve parachute if their main parachutes are not controllable. The idea is that get as much canopy out into the air as possible. If you do have a main canopy that is controllable, you're going to try and flare that canopy for the lowest jumper. In general, after the parachute is deployed, you will always ask these three questions. Is it there? Is it square? And is it steerable? You have to decide by 2,500 feet if you can land with the main parachute that you have, or if you need to cut away and use the reserve parachute. One more situation to talk about. If you have a malfunctioning main parachute below 1,000 feet, you're better off to deploy the reserve without cutting away. Below 1,000 feet, there is not enough time to cut away and then deploy the reserve. So if you have a malfunctioning parachute below 1,000 feet, deploy the reserve only. Do not cut away first. All right, time for a review. How many gear checks do you get, and when do you get those gear checks? What are the parachute decision questions, and how do you tell if a canopy is controllable? What is your decision cutaway altitude, and what does that mean? What is your landing area decision altitude? And what are the altitudes for your downwind, base, and final of your landing pattern? And lastly, what are your landing priorities? At the drop zone, your instructor will put you in the hanging harness to simulate some of these malfunctions that we've seen. They will have slides or photographs to show you different scenarios and see how you respond in each scenario. You'll ask the questions by yourself and go through the emergency procedures if you need to, based on the situation that you are given.